Hi there and welcome to Hearthside. My name is Michelle and I am the author on this blog. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Aun year. And this has been something that has been widely discussed within the heathen community. Rune Rasmussen has been trying to revitalize this practice of the 8-year cycle. And especially in the last month, we have had a lot of discourse in the heathen community about what that is going to look like. A lot of excitement around it, but also I've noticed a little bit of a misunderstanding about why the Aun year is associated with Aun and where that came from. So I think that some people are a bit confused and think that Rune just made that up, but actually it has historic precedence in being a name associated with this 8-year cycle. And it has been in historic sources called a 9-year cycle. This is because the way that time was reckoned back then and the way numbers were reckoned in general, they did not reckon with 0, so it would be 9 years inclusive, which in the modern reckoning would be 8 years. So I want to talk a little bit about Aun's story and about why it's associated with this cycle and what that might look like going forward. And just sort of like look a little bit as well at what Rune might have been thinking picking this particular year. So, who is King Aun? You may be familiar with him. He is in the Ynglinga saga primarily, but also his story is in a number of other sources. And King Aun is this ruler who he wants to live a very long life, perhaps forever. And Odin tells Aun that in order to live longer, he can sacrifice one of his sons every 10 years. Now, I think that this might be a mistake within where it's been recorded, and the reason why I think that is because all the other numbers surrounding the Aun year and also surrounding this story seem to be pretty much 9s. And the reason why I think that it got switched from 9 to 10 is actually a really simple spelling error that could have occurred, because in a lot of the Nordic languages, the word for 9 and the word for 10 are really only one letter off. So someone could have made a mistake at one point, and then that mistake would be copied and copied as the manuscripts were copied over time until finally translated into English, where we wouldn't necessarily think about that particular error that occurred because 10 and 9 are not spelled similarly. So I think it would make more sense if it's actually 9 years, which aligns with the Aun cycle, and we'll see that the Aun cycle was already associated anyways with King Aun as we go forward. So we know it, even within the Aun story, that the number 9 is the number of sons that were sacrificed in the story. We also know that there was 9 years where King Aun was basically drinking milk from a horn like a baby before his death. So we can see that that number does already play a big role in the story. And then we also have this interesting little rhyme that comes from 1689 and was recorded by a Swedish scientist named Oles Rodbeck. And what he heard was from a Swedish farmer, and it was a way that was used to calculate when the Distine market would take place. Now, the Distine market was a market that occurred every 8 years, and it was what happened after the Christianization in the place of the Althing that would have occurred at the same time every 8 years. So what it says in the English translation, the moon strides 12 and 20 under Aun. So we can see that in 1689, Aun was already associated with this 8-year cycle, and that on top of that, this comes from the oral tradition previous to that, so it had been going on for some time. And so if we're looking at the Aun year, why would they need this particular rhyme to remember when it was? And that's because during the time of the Christianization, the calendar switched. And they're trying to sort of overlay one calendar over the other, and they don't really make sense and line up. So this is explaining how to reckon the Aun date, because the new calendar doesn't allow for it, basically. And it gets really mathy in here. And again, we're looking at numbers where they're not calculating with 0, so although it has the numbers 12 and 20, they would be actually 11 and 19. Now, these numbers are not really vital to my point, which is that Aun was already associated at this point in history. Now, the other thing that is interesting about this is that Rune is doing a similar thing to what was happening at this time, in that he's trying to overlay his runic animist calendar over the current Gregorian calendar. And why I find that interesting is that Rune is keeping the leap days of the Gregorian calendar in his runic animist calendar, and the reason for this is it simply makes more sense to modern people. But what is important about this is that the Aun year historically would have been a leap year, but not in the same sense that we understand it now, because now it would be every 4 years and it would be 1 day. But because the historic calendar that existed before the Christianization actually had months of equal length, then instead of a leap day every 4 years, there would be a leap week every 8 years. And this would have been put into the summer months right over top, like just after the midsummer, basically. So historically, what was being marked in the Aun year was this leap year. Now, that was not the reasons for the sacrifices that occurred earlier in the year, and it's also not something that we're obviously going to be celebrating today, because we're still using the leap years of the Gregorian calendar, and that is what makes the most sense. So then what should we be celebrating? And I looked at a little bit at why Rune chose this particular year. And I know he had reasoning that he explained to some other scholars. If it's in one of his videos, I think I missed that particular one. But what interests me is the year he chose within his own Nordic animist calendar. And the year that he chose for the Aun year is associated with R, which is the golden number rune that he uses to mark this year in his calendar. And when he is using these different runes, then he's using them based on the Swedish rune poem that's in his book. And as far as I know, that's the only English translation of this poem that I found anyways. And it says here, the English translation for the our year, year is richest in leaves, year makes all well. And because that is sort of the flavor of the year based on the golden year rune, it's interesting that he would pick a year where the year makes all well, because I think that is exactly his intention in finding a way to sort of reset things every 8 years. And that is actually kind of what the Aun year was about historically as well. So the purpose of the all thing, of course, is to reset any conflicts. And the purpose of the Aun year being a leap year was to reset the calendar. Otherwise it would like move about because it didn't have a leap week. So if we're thinking about this, we were thinking about it in the modern times in a more metaphorical sense, but what we're looking at is a resetting of sorts. And what exactly that looks like, Rune sort of put out to the community, although I think he was aiming for things to do with the environment, which makes sense in the modern context. But also it gives us like some idea about where we should go with it as a heathen community. Now, the thing that I find interesting about the year that Rune chose, now I don't know all of his reasoning, as I said, but I was also reading a paper by Göran Henriksson that's talking about the Aun cycle historically, and I don't know if Rune included any of this in his reasoning or not, but in this particular paper, which I will link below, Henriksson is talking about how the mounds that are at Uppsala might be used to calculate the Aun year using sunrises and sunsets. The other thing included in this particular paper is that some of the historical Aun year dates were known, not very many, but some. So painstakingly you could project when those dates would occur in modern times if you wanted to. So I don't know if Rune included any of that or not, but it just sort of was interesting to me that although it would be difficult to figure out historically when the Aun year would occur in the modern context, it's not impossible. So I want to look also, because I am using the Swedish rune poem in Rune's book, I like to also look at the other rune poems that are more widely available. So there's a Norwegian one, Icelandic one, and an Anglo-Saxon one, just to give us like a little bit more context to what this year could be about, and this would be specific to this Aun year using Rune's calendar and not to Aun years in general, but ideas about what sort of resetting perhaps should occur in this Aun year. And so first I'm looking at the Norwegian poem, and the English translation is, "Plenty is a boon to men. I say that Frodi is generous." And what I think is interesting about this one is that it brings in the historical figure of Frodi, who is a historical king who was believed to cause prosperity in his land, in agriculture, and even after his death, gold was placed in his mound in hopes that that prosperity would continue. And what I find interesting about that is that Frodi is connected with Freyr, and in some versions of the story it's actually Freyr who has a mound where gold is placed in, and prosperity is supposed to come to the land. So Frodi and Freyr are linked in this way, and the Aun story is also linked with Freyr, and the reason why that is because Aun is part of the Ynglinga line, which in Beowulf is also called the Shielding line, which is a line of Danish kings, and they were believed to be descended from Freyr. So perhaps in marking the first Aun year, we should be in some way recognizing Freyr, is just a thought that came to me when I was going through this. And again, the Icelandic poem, very similar language, does not include Frodi in this case, but says plenty, the boon to men, and good summer and thriving crops. So again, the same sort of imagery to do with plenty, prosperity, to do with agriculture, a good summer year, basically. So that seems to me like a very good choice for the first Aun year. We do want it to be prosperous, and in a way, metaphorically, we're wanting to plant seeds and grow them into something for the future. And the final poem is the Anglo-Saxon one. Now this one is always a little bit more problematic to me as a rune poem, because there is Christianized language which has been overlaid over top at some point. So this one reads, "Summer is a joy to men when God, the holy King of heaven, suffers the earth to bring forth shining fruits for rich and poor alike." Now, what I'm taking from this particular poem is that last line, for rich and poor alike. So this is a prosperous year for everyone, for the rich, for the poor, and by extension for all people and all beings. So we need to think about the other beings that we share this landscape with and how to make this year prosperous for them. That's part of the resetting. And I suspect that this was very intentional on Rune's part, to think about this symbolism in choosing this year. And so that's sort of what I was thinking about in this, and I also find it interesting that the next year going forward in the Aun years, if we're using Rune's Reckoning, is described in the Swedish rune poem as being a double golden year, so another year of prosperity, potentially. I don't want to go too far into that at this point, because that is another full 8 years out. But I think the importance of all this is that the story of the cruel King Aun is a cautionary tale about what happens if we're thinking about ourselves primarily and not about our community, and by extension the broader community of all beings. So this is about correcting that. It's not about Aun or making Aun into this figure to be revered. It's actually the warning not to be Aun, to make the necessary changes that benefit all, and to create prosperity by resetting things that need to be reset. And I think like that is what was happening in Uppsala when the All thing occurred. There were sacrifices probably for continued prosperity, but the All thing also is when any things that were going on were resolved. So I hope that this was informative and that it helps you get a better understanding of Aun's story, why it's associated with these years, and I hope that you go further with this and that you build upon it, because there is so much more information than what I was able to provide in this video. This was like a rabbit hole that had rabbit holes inside of it, and like there was so much information that I actually like at some point had to stop myself from continuing, because it was just going to eat up all my time. But I hope that other people find other things that are valuable that they can add. And thank you, Rune, for initiating this, basically. And I will include Rune's channel details below, as well as his information for his book, and I hope to see you next time.